When studying history, it's somehow easy to forget that real people lived it. But sometimes, we are lucky enough to find people who lived through history themselves to tell the tale. Edward Nayara's living history. He came to Cincinnati in 1962 as part of Operation Pedro Pan. Operation Pedro Pan was a pivotal movement in Cuban history, where many families made the unthinkable decision to send their children away to a foreign country in order to avoid the brutal regime of Fidel Castro.
And highlights how a dictator can change somebody's life so instantly and so significantly. One guy comes along and the whole world is turned upside down. Families are split, family members are in jail, people are fleeing the country.
The dictator he mentioned is Fidel Castro, who took power in 1959, displacing Fulgencio Batista. Cuban history has been defined by power struggles for authoritarian rule. Cuba is an island nation located just south of the United States. The country has had powerful and ongoing political conflicts for a variety of reasons. The heart of these political issues can be traced directly to Cuba's controversial leaders. The road to the Cuban Revolution began with President Gerardo Machado, who enjoyed great popularity when he was elected in 1925. This was the year the Socialist Party was founded in Cuba, which formed the basis for the Communist Party. Over time, people became increasingly more fearful of President Machado's rule, as he kept an army of secret police that waged bloody battles against the political opposition. Machado eventually resigned in 1933 and fled Cuba. This was only the beginning of Cuba's long and rocky path to revolution. After Machado, multiple presidents came to power for short terms. It wasn't until Fulgencio Batista seized power as dictator in 1952 did Cuba see a firm rule. Batista had ruled previously as president of Cuba in the 1940s. He emerged as a US-backed leader, marking a turning point in Cuban history. Batista served as president from 1940 to 44 and was later dictator from 1952 to 59. Many, however, were not fond of his regime, as he jailed many of his political opponents and used violent methods to enforce his rule. He transformed Cuba into the first communist state in the Western Hemisphere. After 7 years of dictatorial rule, Batista was overthrown by the communists and Fidel Castro took power. A former military officer, Castro used guerrilla warfare to strike at the Batista regime and eventually lead to its downfall. But the Cuban people soon discovered that they had only traded one dictator for another. For example, under Fidel Castro, schools became much more advanced in Cuba, but for a price.
They had great science programs. They had a lot of math.
While literacy rates steadily rose, students became indoctrinated. All of the classes offered had to be Marxist-friendly. Social sciences were discouraged and rarely taught. Students were taught from a very young age to love Fidel no less than Karl Marx himself. While education and other social programs flourished under his rule, the smallest acts of dissent were punished, and thousands of Cubans were thrown in prison. Many people were denied their basic rights, and some even executed. It was this behavior that made many parents fear for their children's safety in Cuba. Castro was the main source of the conflict, and he made life extremely difficult for many Cuban families. He caused conflict by indoctrinating students and using harsh methods of enforcement to punish any opposition, making Cuba an unsafe place for children to grow up.
They can't no longer be part of any kind of association, whether it's a Rotary Club, the Boy Scouts, or a country club.
Fidel was slowly but surely beginning to control all aspects of society.
But I will never be against any right.
Why, with that attitude, have there been so many executions across Cuba without open, free trials?
Castro's reign of terror was marked by widespread executions, many by firing squad. Due to the fact that Cuba was a closed society, historians can only guess at how many people were executed during his reign. Some have estimated at least 4,000 Cuban citizens were killed from the beginning of Castro's rule to his death in 2016. Many Cubans were forced to make the ultimate sacrifice of splitting up their families for the good of their children. It was feared that kids would be indoctrinated under Castro's rule if they stayed in the country, so many parents made the heartbreaking decision to send their sons and daughters away overseas in order to keep them safe.
My mother was very insistent that my sister and I would leave and come to the United States. My father was very much against it. He felt like Fidel Castro wouldn't last. He was, I think, in great degree blinded by his desire to hold on to the power of the old government.
Between 1960 and 62, 14,048 unaccompanied Cuban minors fled from Havana, Cuba to Miami, Florida in the United States. The kids ranged from ages 6 to 17.
They were wailing. There was so much crying on that plane. I describe it in my book as a funeral in the fuselage of an airplane. It was quite an experience.
Many parents thought that Castro's radical rule wouldn't last and that the families would soon be reunited. They thought their children would have a better life in America until he was eventually overthrown.
I was very attached to my mother as a child, and it was difficult. I was the last one to say goodbye to her, and I put my hand up in the glass, and she put hers up in the glass, and it was quite an experience. Yeah. It's a moment in time that I'll never forget.
This was an extremely heartbreaking and emotional event for both parents and their children as the families separated. Airports were full of sad goodbyes as thousands of kids were flown to the United States alone. The thought of putting their children on an airplane to the States, perhaps never to be seen again, was wrenching for any parent. Kids were instructed to get special student visas and to tell airline employees that they were going to America for school. Once in America, children were placed in boarding homes until they could find a foster family. The Catholic Welfare Bureau cared for a majority of the immigrating children and helped them adjust to their new life in America. Father Brian O. Walsh was the director of the agency, and he played an important role in helping the children find homes. Getting used to new people and surroundings was a difficult task for children so young, and adjustment was a challenge.
Your world is completely strangulated from everything that you think or should be your norm of your life.
I dream of my homeland, my Cuba, of happier days in her valleys and her hills.
Some were lucky enough to be reunited with their families later in life, but others were not so fortunate. Mr. Naero was one of the lucky ones.
Seeing my family was extremely emotional and touching, and seeing how they lived, what they had to do to survive. There was some degree of guilt, I think. In some ways, I felt the adjustment to reunite was more difficult than the adjustment when we separated.
Fidel Castro was in power much longer than anyone had anticipated. Many thought his radical views would lead to him being overthrown in the near future, but this was not the case. Castro was ruler of Cuba for nearly 5 decades before passing over power to his brother Raul. This meant that Cuban immigrants were stranded in America for the majority of their life, some to never see their parents again.
For a parent to feel, I love my children enough that I am going to let them go alone in an unknown world, because that's better protection than what is going to happen here. Operation Pedro Pan is a result of losing a country, losing a home, going away from your parents.
Operation Pedro Pan will go down in history as the largest childhood exodus ever recorded, but many will remember it as an emotional heartbreak when their families were torn apart and some never to be seen again.